January 17, 1942, New London, Connecticut. Before dawn, frost coats the submarine dock in silence. A Mark 14 torpedo waits on its skid, America's secret weapon, polished and promised. But within months, this gleaming cylinder would become a symbol of humiliation. Submarine commanders watched through periscopes as their torpedoes ran beneath enemy ships, too deep to detonate. They heard the sickening clang of warheads striking hulls without exploding. 15 torpedoes fired, 12 hits, only 2 explosions. The rest? Nothing. America had entered the most industrial war in history with submarines armed with weapons that didn't work. The Bureau of Ordnance, wrapped in secrecy and pride, refused to believe their own sailors. For 18 months, men died because bureaucrats trusted blueprints over battle reports. But in machine shops across Connecticut, something else was happening. Machinists were pulling bronze propellers from scrapped fishing boats, civilian relics stained with salt and years of honest work, and transforming them into torpedo parts. Not because the system was perfect, but because the system could admit it was broken. The lathes whine, the hammer's rhythm, the conversion of failure into fighting chance. This is the story of how America's underwater war was saved not by admirals, but by the men who refused to accept defeat from their own weapons. January 17, 1942, New London, Connecticut. Before dawn, the river is a strip of black glass under a low winter sky. Dock lights stain the water a pale yellow, frost whitens the steel fittings, breath hangs in the air like smoke. Inside the submarine base, men in pea coats move with practiced silence, clipboards, lanterns, gloved hands on cold metal. Somewhere a winch groans, and somewhere else a hammer taps, 3 notes against a bulkhead, steady, almost ceremonial. Down on the pier, a Mark 14 torpedo waits on its skid like a sealed promise, a long cylinder of lacquered war paint and brass, the kind of weapon that is supposed to turn a hidden submarine into a decisive force. But in the first months of America's Pacific War, that promise is already breaking. This moment matters because the United States had entered the most industrial war in history with a paradox at its center. A nation that could build aircraft carriers like cities and pour steel like rivers had sent its submarines into combat with their primary weapon system not merely flawed, but distrusted, sometimes catastrophically. And even when the torpedo itself could be repaired, another crisis shadowed it, the strain of production, the scarcity of specialized parts, and the sudden realization that quantity was not a slogan, it was a battlefield condition. The men who boarded American submarines in early 1942 believed they carried an advantage their enemies would learn to fear, a fast, long-range weapon, launched from unseen depths, guided by a gyroscope, driven by a wet heater engine, steam generated by fuel and water under pressure, ending in counter-rotating propellers designed to bite the sea with efficiency. The Mark 14 could be set for high speed, about 46 knots to roughly 4,500 yards, or low speed, about 31.5 knots to roughly 9,000 yards. It carried a heavy warhead, eventually a Torpex charge, meant to tear open the hull of a tanker or transport with a single underwater concussion. That was the expectation. American engineering as inevitability. The reality was humiliating, dangerous, and for the men at sea, often lethal in its consequences. Submarine commanding officers reported torpedoes running too deep, detonators exploding too soon, or not exploding at all. Attacks that looked perfect through a periscope ended with enemy ships still moving, and the submarine forced to stay exposed longer, inviting depth charges and patrol craft. In the dry language of official history, the indictment unfolded point by point during the first 2 years of war, while morale suffered and the enemy was given further respite from the full potential of torpedo warfare. For a German U-boat crew or a Japanese destroyer escort, there was a brutal clarity to what they expected of Americans in 1942. They expected abundance. They expected factories that never slept. They expected a nation that solved problems by overwhelming them. More ships, more planes, more ammunition. The propaganda image of America abroad was not subtle, a continent of machine tools and assembly lines, a place where even mistakes could be replaced by volume. But beneath the surface of the Pacific, American submariners were discovering something darker. The modern state can produce power, and still deliver failure, because confidence, secrecy, and bureaucracy can be as destructive as enemy steel. The Bureau of Ordnance history later admitted what wartime crews felt in their bones. Torpedoes were described as running too deep, not exploding, exploding too soon, and the problem was compounded by the Bureau's reluctance to accept the fleet evaluation of its weapons, a reluctance born from misplaced confidence. The same record bluntly identifies deeper causes. Unrealistic tests, a fetish of secrecy that hid defects, and production planning designed for small-scale craftsmanship rather than war. In war, failure is never abstract. A torpedo that runs deep does not merely miss, it forces a submarine to circle, to re-attack, to linger in hostile water. A premature explosion does not merely waste a weapon, it shouts the submarine's position into the sea. And a dud, an unmistakable metallic against an enemy hull with no detonation, was perhaps the worst of all, because it replaced hope with a kind of dread, the knowledge that even when you were right, you might still be powerless. By mid-1942, the first great flaw had been confirmed, deep running. The official history records that net firings ordered in the summer of 1942 showed the Mark 14 ran an average of 10 feet deeper than set, and on August 1, 1942, the service was formally informed of the 10-foot error. Submariners could compensate only by altering their settings, fighting their own weapon like an unpredictable current. But the cruelty of this story is that correcting one defect exposes another. The diabolical chain reaction, the way one flaw concealed the next, meant that the torpedo scandal did not end when depth was corrected. It only changed shape. The next villain wore the disguise of innovation, the magnetic exploder Mark 6, a device intended to detonate beneath a ship's keel where armor was weakest. The Bureau's own history recounts how secrecy and limited testing helped doom it. A single dramatic success in 1926, sinking a hulk with a magnetic influence exploder, became a trap. Never again was a destructive test made. In the 19 pre-war years that followed, the fleet didn't truly know the weapon, even many who handled it did not fully understand it. By late 1942 and into 1943, prematures and duds poisoned trust. The record notes that submariners believed some 10% of torpedoes were prematures, while the Bureau estimated much lower, an argument that was not merely technical, but cultural, men in combat describing lived reality, men in offices reading paperwork. And then came the day that turned rage into proof. July 24, 1943. USS Tenosa meets a giant Japanese oiler and cripples it, then fires. And fires again. The Bureau of Ordnance History preserves the grim arithmetic: 15 torpedoes fired, 12 known hits claimed, only the first 2 spreads produced explosions. Tenosa returns with 1 torpedo saved for investigation, a physical artifact of betrayal. In war, numbers become prayers. 15 torpedoes is not just expenditure, it is time exposed, risk multiplied, a crew listening for the sound that means success, and hearing instead the silence that means the enemy lives. The investigation that followed was not only engineering, it was a turning point in ideology inside the Navy itself. The official history describes how tests were conducted, firing into cliffs, dropping inert loaded warheads onto steel plates, until the contact exploder failure was understood. On impact, friction and deformation could prevent the firing pin from striking properly. The fix that finally ended the spiral combined solutions, lightening the firing pin, strengthening the spring. An admission, at last, that the fleet's anger was not superstition. But while these technical battles raged in test bays and workshops, another quieter struggle played out in machine shops, one that rarely gets the same dramatic attention as dud torpedoes, yet was just as revealing about how America actually fought. Because even if the Navy could fix the exploder, it still had to build torpedoes in numbers that matched the war's appetite. And torpedoes were not simple products. The Bureau's history admits the pre-war myth that torpedoes could be built only by craftsmen with trade secrets, too often living in some foreman's little black book, not in standardized documentation. That is the language of an older industrial world colliding with total war. This is where your title's human core belongs, machinists confronting scarcity with improvisation. In 1942, America did not merely need torpedoes that worked, it needed torpedoes that existed. Production had to expand. Materials had to be allocated. And in a world where copper alloys were strategic, where every pound of metal had a destination, even a propeller could become a bottleneck. The Mark 14's propulsion was not a poetic detail, it was a chain of dependency. The wet heater engine required precision. The afterbody demanded careful machining. And at the very end, where power became motion, were the propellers, the rotating blades that translated combustion into pursuit. They were, in a way, the last handshake between American industry and the ocean. So imagine the symbolic object now, the one that will carry through this story like a recurring note, a salvaged bronze propeller. Not a warship's proud screw, not a polished trophy, but a propeller taken from something humble, a scrapped fishing boat, its blades nicked by years of work, its hub stained by salt and grease, its metal already shaped by civilian labor. In that propeller is the entire contradiction of American abundance, a country wealthy enough to own fleets of small boats, yet suddenly so pressed by war that even those civilian relics could be melted down, machined, reborn into weapons. A German submariner in 1942 might have expected American industry to be sleek and centralized, the kind of machine that produces perfect weapons in perfect sequence. A Japanese naval officer might have expected America's strength to come from grand strategy and massed fleets. Few would have expected that part of America's undersea war would depend on scavenging, on the reuse of ordinary metal, on machinists who treated scrap as potential. Yet that improvisation was itself a kind of industrial democracy, the war effort pulling from every corner of civilian life, transforming private objects into public purpose. And the sound that accompanies it, the recurring sound that can live through the narration as symbol, is the machine shop's rhythm, the lathe's steady whine, the cutting tool's hiss, the hammer's measured strikes. In the opening scene we heard tapping, now we understand it as the heartbeat of conversion. Where authoritarian systems often claimed efficiency through command, America's peculiar strength was that it could mobilize not just orders, but participation, factories, small yards, women in wartime production, local scrap drives, and the invisible labor of skilled hands. Official accounts of the torpedo crisis show how deeply the war forced institutional change. Admiral Blandy's directive, quoted in the Bureau history, is not just a technical memo. It is a confession that peacetime culture had failed and that policy had to be rebuilt around reality. He wrote that work being done after a year and a half of war could and should have been accomplished years ago, and ordered as permanent policy that no service torpedo device ever be adopted as standard until it has been tested under conditions simulating battle. That is transformation in bureaucratic form, the institution forced to exchange pride for proof. Now let the salvaged propeller return again and again in the mind's eye. It sits on a workbench under harsh light. It is weighed, measured, perhaps cut down, perhaps used as raw material, perhaps modeled for casting. However the exact shop practice is depicted, the emotional truth remains. It was not glamorous, and it was not inevitable. It was a choice to refuse defeat by inconvenience. And that, ultimately, is what changed perception, on both sides of the war. For American submariners, the torpedo crisis taught a bitter lesson. Technology is not virtue. It must be tested, questioned, argued with, and sometimes repaired in defiance of authority. For the Navy's leadership, it exposed the danger of secrecy that protects reputations more than sailors. And for America's enemies, the larger truth emerged not in 1942 but afterward, once the system corrected itself, once the machine shop won its argument with the office. The United States could turn the ocean into a denied space, and enemy shipping into a dwindling list. The Bureau history notes the strategic outcome plainly. Submarines sank some 5 million tons of enemy shipping and damaged another 2.5 million tons, using torpedoes that, after painful correction, became reliable enough to fulfill their purpose. But the epilogue of this story is not merely victory statistics. It is the quiet meaning of that salvaged propeller, metal once dedicated to feeding a family, now reforged into a weapon that helped end a war. Freedom and abundance are not synonyms. A nation can be rich and still unready, powerful and still wrong. The difference is whether it can admit error without collapsing, whether it can turn criticism into correction, and shortage into invention. In the end, the machine shop sound returns, the same steady rhythm from the opening, no longer a nervous tapping in the dark, but the measured work of a society converting itself. Not perfectly, not quickly, but openly, through argument, through evidence, through 1,000 hands. And somewhere in that long chain, between the fishing pier and the torpedo pier, between the civilian boatyard and the naval depot, spins the same object, reborn, a propeller, biting the water, pushing forward. Not because America was flawless, but because America could change.